This is the Used Car Dealer Podcast with your hosts, Zach Klemp and Steve McClory.
Well, hello, this is Zach Klemp, and you're listening to episode number 7 of the Used Car Dealer Podcast. And we have a very special guest today, and that's Steve Greenfield. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Steve, he's the CEO and founder of Automotive Ventures. He's been in the auto software industry over the last 20 years, and he's overseen over $1 billion in automotive technology acquisitions. And he's held roles at TrueCar, Auto Trader, and his LinkedIn posts get a lot of views in the automotive industry. How are you doing, Steve?
Zach, I'm great. I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, for our listeners, tell them a little bit about yourself and how you got into the business.
Yeah, well, great. I'd love to. Like a lot of people, I think I kind of stumbled into it. I grew up in Toronto, up in Canada, and never imagined that I'd be in the auto industry, and never imagined that I'd be down in the U.S. So back in '99, I had a buddy who started working for an auto auction, and at that point, I didn't even know what auto auctions were. I presumed that when I drove by dealers' lots, all the cars came from trade-ins. And, I quickly learned about the auction business, but I was hired to be an technology manager, they called it at the time. And, if you roll back the clock to 99, it was the very early days of the internet. The auction was Toronto Auto Auction, which is now Manheim, Toronto, which was and is the largest auction up in Canada. And I had a chance to be this technology manager selling software to car dealers. And in 99, as you can imagine, we were trying to get dealers to buy access to Manheim.com, which was $50 a month. And most of the dealers that I would meet with not only didn't have the internet, they didn't even have a computer. So at the time, we were buying them 486 PCs. You're too young, probably, Zach, to even know what those were. But we were buying them PCs, getting them hooked up online, so they could literally buy cars online through like an eBay like platform. So that was my start. I luckily enough did pretty well with sales up there. They asked me to move down to the corporate office of Manheim, which was down in Atlanta, Georgia, which is where I am now. And I've been down in Atlanta now for about 20 years.
Wow. And what were some of your learnings as both an entrepreneur and an executive in automotive software about inventory management? And that's a really timely topic, especially right now in the COVID climate.
Yeah, it's a good question. I came from about 10 years on the wholesale side. So I understand pretty intimately how dealers were thinking about stocking inventory from the wholesale channel, be it online sales that I was responsible for a while there, as well as spent a lot of time with our physical auctions. Then, in 2010, I actually had a chance to go over to a sister company, Autotrader.com, which at the time was just starting down the path of acquisitions. And I had a chance to report to the CEO and oversee those acquisitions. So within about 14 months, we bought a bunch of companies, including vAuto. And everybody probably is aware of vAuto, but Dale Pollock, the very visionary founder of vAuto, really started sort of like the concept and was the father of the concept around bringing science and data to inventory management and pricing. So I had a lot of time to spend during the acquisition and subsequently working very closely with Dale and his folks, the technology folks there that built out the product to focus on inventory management. And it's been interesting to see that product after, we bought an Auto Trader and subsequently got tucked into Cox Automotive, how dominant it's become and how now it's very hard to find dealers that aren't using the same sort of science around, market day supply demand to indicate which cars to stock, but also kind of working backwards from what the retail selling prices are to figure out what they can price cars for it and make sure they still have enough margin in the deal.
Right. And I saw an interesting post you had today about weekly wholesale auction volumes. I'd love to, get some more context into that for our listeners. and it's especially timely right now.
Yeah, I mean, well, what Zach's referencing is I just took a snippet out of a JD Power COVID-19 weekly report that's coming out that I'm sure you can find online if you Google it. But I was actually shocked. I mean, shocked so much that I shared it. But you look at the auction volumes have dropped off a cliff, and it's not really surprising. I think ADESA, car has basically shuttered the physical locations entirely. I think Manheim had seen this coming and shifted quickly to online sales only. But at least they were able to keep a skeleton crew of people at the physical auctions, keeping the cars selling, and be able to at least get the online listings up for dealers to stock. But I would say, Zach, the way I look at it is, everything starts with the consumer, right? So now we've got all the consumers in America who are sheltered up in their homes, whether they're unemployed or not. What we've got is, interestingly enough, online shopping activity is actually up at these portals, right? You look at companies like Disney Plus and Netflix, Apple and Amazon and YouTube very publicly have said that they've started throttling traffic because the streaming quality of those services now has been brought down. We're not getting, HD quality on streaming right now because, every consumer in America is sitting around all day and they're online. It's a burden to the system. Meanwhile, Auto Trader recently announced that actual vehicle detail pages, VDPs, on their vehicles on autotrader.com were actually up 7% the last weekend in March, and up 11% on Kelley Blue Book visits.
Interesting.
So it's kind of interesting that you've got more consumers online, but clearly, the flip side of that is now, if you look at the news as of this morning, another 6.6 million people filed for unemployment last week. So now, as a result of COVID, we're up to, 16.8 million lost jobs just in the last 3 weeks, right? So that just put that in context. That's more job losses than the Great Recession in 2008 caused over 2 years, right? So we've gotten more unemployed in 3 weeks than we did over 2 years in the largest financial recession in the U.S.'s history, right? So some economists are speculating that U.S. employment rate may go up to 15%. I saw, some 17%, and likely this is going to go higher over the next couple of weeks as things start to settle in and we get clearer line of sight on what the impact's going to be, right? So circling back to your question, right? When consumers are forced to be at home and there's a growing number of them being unemployed, clearly there's less retail demand for vehicles, even though there's more shoppers online, less people buying cars, less mileage being put on cars. And that's trickling down to the wholesale auction. So as you mentioned, the JD Power data was that, fewer than 15,000 units were sold last week, which was a 37% decrease just over the previous week. And, in terms of pricing also is weak, not as weak as volumes decreasing, but you got to imagine, there's less demand from consumers, therefore less demand from dealers in the lanes. And, JD Power is expecting a 7% decrease in prices before the recovery begins. But I suspect that it's going to be worse than that. I got to imagine as demand dries up from consumers and dealers aren't, bidding in the auction lanes, we're going to see much more of a dramatic fall off in prices. So if you can price the market right, or you can time the market right, I'm sure there's going to be stories where people got a steal on certain vehicles as demand inevitably comes back. But at some point here, it's the timing, the devil's going to be in the details, and it's going to be a little bit more art than science trying to call the bottom of this thing.
Right. And that makes a lot of sense. And I'm curious, Steve, what are your thoughts about some of the evolutions in wholesale? You have products like backlot cars, ACV auctions. Just curious, what your thoughts are on some of these new vendors coming into the wholesale auction space.
Well, it's super exciting for me having, now been in the industry for 20 years and the first 10 of those at Manheim. And like I said, I was right in the midst of the beginning of selling cars online at auctions, right? So we were photographing vehicles back in 99 and uploading them. And it was super clunky, as you can imagine at that point, but we still had dealers buying cars back then. Most of those were the off-lease cars and the executive cars that were very, very high quality. But now that you've got all these platforms like the ones you've mentioned, Backlot, ACV, others that are out there, I mean, I'm super excited. And they're obviously, it's been public. They've been raising a lot of money recently. There's a lot of VC money chasing this and understanding that, the big incumbents, Manheim and ADESA, are in a position where they've had very defensible, large businesses for a long time. But clearly these smaller companies are attacking them and figuring out clever ways to do it. I think I'm a big fan. I think that it's interesting, and there's a lot of opportunity for them to help dealers, get vehicles online, consignment cars, and eventually it's clear that to me that they'll also then start getting into offering fleet cars and getting upstream, quote unquote, from the auction, offering off-lease cars, etc. The Manheims and the ADESAs of the world can't be happy with the way this is playing out. But inevitably, like any big industry where you've got a couple of big dominant players, we're seeing a lot of potential disruption happening from some of these pure technology players.
Interesting. And one concept that's really top of mind to a lot of dealers right now is digital retail, especially in the COVID-19 climate. And you have a lot of experience with digital retail. And I wanted to get your thoughts, and especially on the conversation we had on the fact that a lot of these digital retail tools, there's over 30 of them in the space. Some of them have raised a lot of venture capital. Some of the traditional dealer website companies are building their own digital retail tools. I guess for the dealers listening, give them, in your opinion, what exactly digital retail is and why it could be useful for them. And then from the market standpoint, talk about kind of the saturation of players in the space.
Yeah, great question, and area of passion of mine, as you know, Zach. So I guess I'd start with, there's no shortage of digital, quote unquote, digital retailing players out there. Right? I always like to go to, this is my 20th year now that I've had a chance to go to NADA. And for the last 5 or 6 years, I guess it's 6 years now, I've counted the number of players that are offering digital retailing solutions. And at last count this year, I think I was up over 30. And the reason is a couple of different reasons, I guess, right? One is, as you just mentioned, pretty much every dealer website company now, and there are many, are offering their own sort of white labeled version, right? So now that if I have a dealer website, which every dealer does, typically that dealer website provider can provide you a version that's totally integrated and part of the regular flow. So you no longer have to go out and buy, from a third party, a non-dealer website provider, and have it, inserted into your website as a standalone widget. There are sometimes benefits to that, but so there's competition now from the website providers. Also, I would say that the promise 6 years ago was, consumers were literally going to, configure a car deal from home and click the home delivery button. And back then it was like, pre-Carvana, it was very Carvana-esque, right? Or it was early days of Carvana, but, Carvana really riffed off of that. And the vision was that any dealer was going to be able to offer this kind of completed car deal, home delivery, the entire e-commerce, Amazonization of the car deal. And it hasn't really played out that way. I think that most of these quote unquote digital retailing players are basically selling an enhanced lead. So dealers understand that they get only so much traffic to their website every month. And usually a lot of that is they have to pay for, Google or other third parties. They get the traffic to their website, and dealers sort of very cleverly say, how can I convert that traffic to more foot traffic, more leads, more phone calls, more emails, more opportunities for them to sell a car. And I think that in most cases, dealers are seeing these digital retailing players as simply conversion mechanisms. So I can order this or buy this digital retailing tool. It will help me take my website traffic and convert more of them to phone, email leads, chat leads, or hopefully, foot traffic that I can then sell a car to. So given that, we've strayed a bit away from the original vision, which was this kind of A to Z entire car deal online driveway delivery, to more of just an enhanced lead now, right? So I think to your point, there are a lot of them now. I expect especially with the strain on the economy, the strain on dealers, and them cutting back on some of their vendors. Some of the more recent startups and the ones that are on the cusp, the less funded folks, the folks that have less money in the bank to weather the short-term disruption, we may see a clearing out, and some of the weak players may go away entirely here, which I don't think is a bad thing. I mean, it's always sad to say that if companies go away, but right now I think it's almost overwhelming for a dealer to sort through all the different digital retailing tools and make sense of them and which ones are better.
Right. Completely agree with you. And from the dealer standpoint, I guess what considerations should they have before implementing a digital retail tool, and maybe demystify some of the ideas that a dealer might expect, or, ways of transaction a dealers might expect from a digital retail tool versus reality?
Yeah. So the main thing is just be honest with yourself what you want to get out of it, right? So if you want to get more consumers that are coming in who have self-identified their credit worthiness, like self-report their FICO score, and have indicated what trade-in they have and how much they want for their trade. So when they do first, call you or walk in, you have a lot more intelligence in your CRM. That makes perfect sense. And a number of the different digital retailing tools can do that. If you aspire more aggressively to really offering, a presentation of F&I products, which scares a lot of dealers because they're worried about retaining profitability when they provide too much transparency with F&I products. But if you did, and you wanted to present F&I products and literally offer driveway delivery, so you have a driver drive the car to the person, then there are some dealers that want that, then you probably would look at a different subset of digital retailing tools that are out there. So I think that starting with what you want to achieve helps you sort through, how sophisticated a solution you need. And then I'm always a big fan of dealers talking to other dealers, right? So whether you've got people in your network, I would say that typically, and Zach, you know this very well, the testimonial videos that you might see on, a vendor's website usually are, folks that they know really well, have a long-standing relationship with. You might want to ask for 10 examples, right? Ask the vendor for 10 different dealers, and don't be shy about reaching out to them. Call dealers that you want, a mixture of dealers that have been on the product for a long time and dealers that have recently signed up. And your questions would be different, right? I think your questions to a vendor or a dealer that's been on a vendor for a long time might be, what value did you see before and after? And what value are you realizing now? And why do you stay on the product? Whereas, if you talk to a dealer that's recently made a decision, ask them things like, who were you on before? What's your objectives with this? And how did you make your decision to go with this particular vendor? So I think that some combination of being really honest with what you want to accomplish, and then making sure you do the reference checks to find other dealers who are objective and can share with you the honest truth about how these products are performing for them.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think two other considerations for dealers, if you're going to get a reference, make sure it's a comparable dealer to yourself. Like if you're an independent Jeep, Dodge, Chrysler dealer, as a reference might not be as helpful. Or if you're a Highline dealer, you might want to talk to a similar dealership that runs, in a similar way to yourself. And then think about the marketing communication to your customers. They go on your website and then you suddenly have a digital retail tool. How have you educated that potential customer on how to use that tool, how you work with, for instance, remote deliveries or remote paperwork, and, really make sure that you communicate that well, because there could definitely be some confusion there.
Agreed. I couldn't agree more with your points.
So, Steve, as you look at the future and as we go through the COVID-19 pandemic, what are some of your predictions on potential changes to the dealership model post-COVID?
Yeah, so we're in for a rough time here. I'm stating the obvious, right? But I mean, I see all these forecasts from various folks. I saw last week, TrueCar's ALG business forecasted that we're going to have a 29% year-over-year decrease in used car sales. I think that JD Power comes in with their own numbers that might be even lower than that. Cox Automotive said that we're going to be down to 38 million, or worst case scenario, 36 million. I mean, right now, nobody knows, right? Because one, nobody knows when consumers are going to get back to being in the mood to buying. We don't know how bad unemployment's going to get. And frankly, no one knows when we're going to get a vaccine for the virus. And, if the return to business as usual is going to be 6 months, 9 months, 18 months, right? So we can only speculate at this point. So it's really hard. I mean, anyone who's talking about future numbers right now really is speculating. So the numbers are all over the board. But I would say, I'm convinced. I wrote an article recently, and I'm convinced that whether you go back to 2008 and the financial downturn, right, whether you go back to the terrorist attack in 9/11, consumers crave getting back to normal, right? I mean, especially now that everybody's stuck at home, wrestling with all the challenges that has. I think people are going to love getting back to things as normal as possible afterwards. And that's going to include, buying cars physically from dealers and being able to go in and test drive and negotiate face to face. I do believe there will be innovations. There's no doubt. Every downturn, great companies are built and very innovative solutions. Do I believe that fundamentally the consumer is going to change the way that they shop and buy cars? I don't believe that's the case at all. I think that, as quickly as consumers can, they'll get back to doing things the old way. And that includes car shopping. That includes going into Best Buy and buying electronics. That includes, getting out to restaurants. I think that we probably will see a lot of pent up demand. For those that aren't unemployed, they're going to be saving a lot of money because they're not out, going to movie theaters and, buying a lot of things right now because of all the uncertainty. So I am hopeful that the economy will come back pretty aggressively afterwards. But the problem is we don't know how bad things are going to get in the interim and, the extent of that and the length of that. But, I don't know that there's going to be a lot of change, 18 months, 2 years from now, as we look back at this, hopefully as a distant memory that was painful, to car shopping. But I'd be willing to bet there'll be some interesting innovations that come out of this, new companies that are formed. They're just taking a different approach entirely at, car shopping and car buying.
Most definitely. And thanks again, Steve, for taking time to get on the Used Car Dealer podcast today. You really have your fingers on the pulse of what's going on in the industry. And it's been a pleasure talking with you today.
Zach, it's always great joining you. And I look forward to talking to you soon.